Today we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Soviet Union, and also the rise of Hitler. So for next time, be sure to have started reading Mueller's Eyewitness Auschwitz. That particular work is going to be very important for your reading. If you've already completed your research paper and your reflection, this is your last required text to read, and so I commend it to you, and I think that you must read this text in order to really have a insight into the Holocaust. Of course, next time on Thursday, we'll be talking about the Second World War. In order to talk about the Russian Revolution, I'm going to refresh in your mind the ideology of socialism, because the ideology of socialism is the ideology that fuels the Russian Revolution. It is the system of thought that causes such a turmoil and a toppling of the old regime overtaking the aristocracy led by Nicholas II. So, socialism is the idea that there will always be an oppressed people, and those oppressed people are going to eventually overturn their oppressors. And in the ideology of socialism, in the historical moment that we are living in the 20th century, the people that are oppressed are the factory workers, which are called the proletariat, and they are going to rise up and overcome the middle class bourgeoisie factory owners and managers, along with the aristocracy that is still in place. And they are going to create an egalitarian society where there is no top class, no bottom class, but there is solidarity and cooperation, and human capability is going to produce and progress in a rapid and peaceful and harmonic way. With this ideology, there is the abolition of private property. In a capitalistic society, private property is incredibly important, but in a socialistic society, private property is actually disgusting and unnecessary. And so nobody needs to own anything, but they are to work in harmony and in somewhat of a utopian kind of a mindset. And so, with socialism, the corporate body is more important than the individual. And so, each individual serves the larger body. And all together, when you bring all of the individuals together, the sum of the whole is much greater because of the cooperation of these individual parts. The main proponent of and engineer of the idea of socialism is Karl Marx. It's sometimes also called Marxism, and him and Frederick Engels wrote together the famous work, The Communist Manifesto, which puts together and constructs this idea that throughout all of history, all existing society ends up being the history of class struggles. And so I just iterated to you the most recent uh, demonstration of that class struggle between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie. So, of course, his main contribution is the utopian ideal of creating an egalitarian society, abolishing private property, and having the proletariat rise up above and abolish all class structures that exist. So Marxism is the idea that human societies develop from class struggle. Uh, the person who champions Karl Marx's Marxism and socialism and is one of the key figures behind the Russian Revolution is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He is otherwise known as Lenin, and he ends up being a pivotal personality of cult type figure that all of the peoples rally around as a person who topples over against the aristocracy of Tsar Nicholas II. In 1897, he's arrested for sedition. He also marries Nadezhda Krupskaya. In 1903, he becomes the key leader of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And then in October of 1917, he is the leader of the October Revolution, which we'll talk about more when we look at the next slide on the timeline. And then from 1917 on, he is the leader of the Bolshevik Party. And the Bolshevik Party is this party of social democratic ideology of socialism. And so in 1922, after the Civil War is over, he helps form the Soviet Union. He was a promoter of world revolution for international communism. He was the ideological figurehead of Marxism, and so he had this personality cult that surrounded him. He created new economic policies, and he redistributed Russian lands and nationalized the banks and industry. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how the Russian Revolution came about. In August 1915, in the throes of World War I, or the Great War, Tsar Nicholas takes personal command of the Russian front. While he's taking personal command of the Russian front, his wife is responsible basically for running the economy and the policy. And of course, they have these advisors that are there. He has his generals, she has her economic advisors. But throughout 1916 and early 1917, there is this bread crisis, there's rioting, there is hunger, there is resources that are being allocated to the front lines. The Brusilov offensive is a major failure in June and July of 1916. They don't have adequate resources for this offensive that Tsar Nicholas is basically leading on the Russian front. There are men that are going into battle and charging into battle, and they don't even have a rifle in their hands. They're waiting for men of their company to be shot down, and they will pick up their rifle and whatever bullets are there and use it, or they will pick up a rifle from the opposition, or if possible. This Brusilov offensive is a failure. In January of 1917, the Mensheviks call for a revolution. The following month, in February, you have the revolution actually starting, the February Revolution, where you have bread rioters, you have disaffected soldiers who have actually left and have gone back to the city of Petrograd. And they are allying themselves with the women who are hungry, and they are marching in the streets. And on 28th of February, the soldiers who are supposed to be defending Petrograd surrender and mutiny and turn to the side of the Social Democratic revolutionaries. And on March 2nd, Tsar Nicholas abdicates. The following month, Lenin gives his April thesis, and in June, there is a major Russian offensive that fails again, and that takes the Russians completely out of the war. In August of 1917, the Kornilov affair takes place, and in the Kornilov affair, there is a group of the White Army, which is those who are supposed to be loyal to Tsar Nicholas's family and the aristocracy and the standing order. They end up marching towards Petrograd, and they also meet with the Bolsheviks, and the Bolshevik army and the White Army have a conversation. And in this conversation, Kornilov and his men basically turn over authority, and Petrograd is won basically without a bullet being even fired in October, and that's called the October Revolution. Following that is the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. With that treaty, all Polish lands are surrendered. Lithuania and a lot of the eastern Russian satellite countries are given their freedom. And civil war occurs for the next 4 years. And this quote comes from the Russian Revolution, where it says, "The February Revolution gave rise to a short-lived mood of national unity and optimism. Liberty and democracy were the order of the day. Overnight, everyone was transformed from a subject into a citizen, all agreeing that they must organize in order to realize their freedom." And so Soviet communism comes about. Soviet communism is a totalitarian rule behind a strong authority. Lenin is the first, Trotsky is the second, and Trotsky uses the cult personality of Lenin, who has since deceased, to continue to get momentum going to fulfill the ideals that Lenin was trying to create. Soviet communism was built off of propaganda. Of course, that propaganda is built around the cult figure of Lenin. There's a great amount of party disparity, and intimidation is used to enforce people to work. They say that there's not a class difference, but within Soviet communism, you have the people at the top of the party and you have the people that are working at the bottom of the party. And the goal was for somebody to get out of the working class and to become one of the secular kind of cult leaders who are championing this propaganda and in charge of other people. So it creates this new kind of socialistic bourgeoisie anyway. There's this secular cult of religion around Lenin, and then there's a redistribution of property so that everybody gets an equal share. And then the banks were nationalized and industry were also nationalized and reoriented with Soviet communism. So from 1918 to 1922, there's actually mass chaos in Russia, and there was a civil war taking place between the Red Army, the White Army, and the Social Revolutionaries. The Social Revolutionaries were the largest group. They were the peasant class. And in November 1917, they actually won the democratic election. They were loyal to the provisional government, but they ended up losing all power to the Red Army. The White Army were the counter-revolutionaries. These are the people that were loyal to the aristocrats, and they were the bourgeoisie class, so these people remained capitalistic. They were against the Bolsheviks, which were the Red Army. They were aided by the Triple Entente. So they were aided by Britain, they were aided by France, and they were aided by the Americans. They had a very disorganized administration, and they had a disunity of their leaders, and they weren't really able to gain any power. In fact, the reason why the Red Army won is because they occupied cities, they gained control of the rail lines, they gained control of the telegraph systems, they had power over communication, and they had a much stronger standing army. A lot of the men who had experience during World War I are those who populated the Bolshevik army. So the Bolsheviks were made up of these Russian Socialist Democrat Labor Party members. They were led by Lenin, they were led by Trotsky, they were led by Stalin. They were the working class people. They were a minority that seized power, but once they got that power, they held onto it tightly, and they used propaganda and intimidation to retain and to keep that property. They were revolutionaries, fully devoted to their cause, and the best way in which they were able to fund their army was to commit bank robberies. And so throughout the Russian Civil War, they were robbing banks and taking money away from the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats, and they were then using that money that had been robbed to fund their military strategy. A quote from the Russian Revolution, a very short introduction. Yet the Civil War was more than a straight struggle between reds and whites. Initially, the so-called democratic counter-revolution led by the social revolutionaries posed at least as great a threat to Bolshevik rule. Perhaps the greatest advantage enjoyed by the Reds was strategic, their possession of a centrality located in compact territory. This meant that they could send forces from one front to another without great difficulty, since railways radiated outwards from Moscow. By contrast, the whites were strung out along the periphery of Europe and European Russia. And so the Russian socialists eventually moved the location of power to Moscow, and they accumulate such power and influence that they become a world power to be reckoned with during the interwar period as you approach World War II. And so next we're going to talk about fascism, Adolf Hitler, and his rise of power that took place.